Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland, get to chat to some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of self-publishing and writing. And today we are delighted to have a very special guest. She is Courtney Brandt, a very successful young YA fiction author who is here to discuss some fascinating things with us. So we are absolutely delighted to have you here, Courtney. How are you doing today?
I am doing quite well. I'm a longtime fan, so I'm really excited to be here.
Oh, that's such a kind thing to say. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and author himself, Craig Touch. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Roland, and welcome, Courtney. We've been searching a long time for our one long-term fan, so I'm glad that we got you on here finally. So, yeah, you write YA, but one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about was the idea of writing in first person versus third person, which is something that, most authors have to make that decision at some point, right? Those are the key. I mean, there are other things than first and third, but those are obviously the two biggest and most popular, and almost every book is written in one of those two. So, but it's often, it's a decision about, how to tell your story, which way you want to go. And there's reasons to choose one over the other, and you I believe write in both, right? Or you have the the experience with both of them, so you were gonna help walk us through all those different things, right?
I was. So I think, especially if we look at young adult contemporary or historical fiction, it really doesn't matter the genre. There's something, and I'm 43 next month. I have always written like a 16-year-old. I love the experience of high school, kind of sharing those things. To me, those feelings feel very now, and they feel very personal. And I think that my first 4 books, while they were written third person, as I started getting into the genre and as I started kind of exploring, I always felt that my protagonists really needed to tell their story, and it needed to be done in their own words. So I have switched back and forth. But I'll give you one better, which is you can play with the tenses, right? So usually I am first person past, but I have been exploring first person present. So how do we make that story even more in the now? And there are great examples out there in the genre and across, not only young adult, but I think there's something just inherently personal that maybe is specific to YA, and readers and your listeners can disagree. But for me, it is a personal story.
I'm so delighted to have this conversation, because it's something I think for me, I started off writing in romance, but I came from a background of liking adventure stories and things. So I wrote in third person, and it wasn't until sort of book 4 that I switched to first person, and it just changed everything for me. And it just made everything sort of come alive. It's so fascinating to think of what an important distinction these two things are, even though it might be the same story.
I also think that it to me as a reader, and I know you're both readers as well, that when I get that first page, I'm drawn in faster by the first person, kind of outline in that first person. There are, just being in someone's story immediately. I think it's not difficult or not difficult. Everybody's going to tell their story their own way. But to me, I become immediately drawn into a story when I get that really good first person, because I need to know I'm with that him or her, whoever the character is. I'm right there. And I think that that's something that really first person can offer that maybe third person can't.
It's almost neuro-linguistic programming, isn't it? It's like if you read the book, I did this, I did that, you can't help but be drawn into it in a way that third person, you have like this omnipresent God view, and you have to actually work out which character you're going to focus on and then try and empathize with them. Whereas that first person does have that directness.
It does. And I think it also can be a challenge to writers in that we can only see really what's happening to the first person. So if you make that choice, you really have to plan that outline to say, okay, I know as the author something else is going on or something, but how can I clue that in? Does my protagonist get that clue? Like, what's happening? And I think that it's it offers, engagement immediately, but then it also offers the challenge that in third person you would say, oh, okay, well, I can, we can cut to here and cut to there. But in first person, you really have to remain with that character. So how are you telling a story in a way that, show don't tell, but we have to tell some things, but we can't tell everything because, unless your protagonist is, a goddess or a god, they don't have omnipresent and omniscient views of things. So you have to kind of plan that out.
Yeah.
Do you ever write with alternating points of view, like one character's first person and then another person's in the same book? Because I know in romance, in romance, it's almost like a staple of his viewpoint, her viewpoint, his viewpoint, her viewpoint. And that allows you to have, you as the reader, know what both of the characters know, but each of the characters only knows what they know. And that has the potential for those delightful conflicts to come up.
It does. Romance is it's one of my favorite genres. I have tried my hand at it a few times, but I'm always in awe of people do it. I had started a project very early days about kind of, you'll see it, it's called Take One at Mulholland High. It's a reality show. And I wanted to do a character who had moved in to this exclusive community in Southern California, and she would be our kind of ears and eyes. So it was still important to keep her in first person and then have the character on the show who's been there forever. She's in first person, but they're very different viewpoints. What happens, how they become friends, how they misinterpret things. As you said with romance, that when we think about tension and conflict, those resolutions can only come because we know as the reader, oh, okay, this is what they thought, or this is why they didn't get along. So I'm with you that romance is an outstanding example. It's not just obviously alternating first person doesn't have to be just for YA.
Yeah, I mean, people use third person in romance, but definitely not as frequently. And I think that's the reason, is like you get to hear the inner thoughts of a person, and which with romance is much more important. You want that deeper level of connection with the characters and of understanding of what they're thinking and what they're doing, and I think some genres, I'm reading all those Jack Reacher books now, and almost all of them are third person, but once in a while he'll sprinkle a first person in there. But, with action and adventure and thrillers and stuff like that, I think you kind of almost need that third person, because there's a lot of things you got to be able to see that the main character doesn't necessarily see,
Yeah, I've had a few manuscripts that aren't out yet, and especially in adult contemporary, I've got a thriller that's unpublished that I had too many characters. I couldn't just be with one character. It wasn't, as I said it earlier, that I think to me YA is so personal. But if you think of different genres, if I'm reading traditional thriller or contemporary fiction, that I really don't want to maybe stick with one character. I want to move around. I want to see what other people are doing. And I think it adds to the story. So it just depends on what I'm writing and what your listeners or readers or watchers get into. That, think about books that hit with you and why they did that. Or if it's something that you really want to play with a genre, why did that work or not work? You really have to kind of think of it. And now that I've got that first person I in my head, when I sit down page one, it's often, if I'm continuing a story, it's very easy to get back into, I write mostly women or young women, so it's easy to get back into her shoes. But then sometimes I take that step back and go, actually, for this type of genre, it's got to be third person for these reasons, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think with third person, well, there's certain kind of readers too that only prefer one or the other. I've seen people say, I only read third person, I only read first person, right? So it's, I don't know, I guess for some people it's maybe jarring one way or the other, but like personally I'm fine with both. But do you tend to find that an author should stick with one type, especially through one pen name or one series? Or I find with the Reacher books, like most of them are third person, but there are some first person in there. I think it's an interesting choice. Like I would have probably, if I was writing a series, I would stick with the same perspective throughout, but works for him, he's making lots of money.
Yeah, I do stick with one voice or one format. Let's say for my series, I think there was one, and I'm blanking. It was one of the when all the Hunger Games books were out. There was a series where there were 3 books, and then the 4th book they changed to have both protagonists, and it was, I think, especially if you're doing first person and you have 2 protagonists, especially, you have to be so clear in those voices. And that was maybe a mistake that this author had made, is that I couldn't tell. I had to literally see at the top, oh, this is, Jack, not Jack Reacher, but this is Jack versus Diane or whatever it is. And you have to be so strong in, because as a reader, we want to be engaged by that person. And if it's first person and you've got different voices and the voices aren't different enough, it was jarring. I was like, okay, but who's talking now? So I think also as a reader, for my series at least, that to start in one would be to finish it. And I can't, if I want to be sneaky, I would say if I'm trying to fit a third person in, a good idea might be a letter or an email, something that our character's reading from something else. We can take that little moment out. So I had kind of a steampunk historical YA Queen of England series that I did a few years ago. And to bring in something else, I could have letters from different characters come in. So maybe we get a little insight into what the other characters are thinking, but still maintaining that first person.
That's that's kind of interesting. I was reading an adventure story that was set with alternating character viewpoints. It was one brother, then the other brother, then one brother, then the other brother. And there was just one section where it went from one brother to the same brother. And it threw me because I'd been kind of expecting it to go back to the other brother. And then I had to pause for a second to be like, oh, wait a second, which character am I following? And so you're right. That's one of the risks you have if you like switch things around too much.
Yeah, it's I think you have to be, and I've written now a lot of books. So I think I'm pretty secure, but for people that are starting out, I think it could even be maybe a suggestion that if you are running into, the dreaded writer's block, what if you change from third to first? What if that helps you get over something, that either as a writing exercise or just getting to know your characters? Okay, yes, in your genre, you might need to write third person, but that as you go, okay, well, I need to get to know this character a little bit more. Why not do a draft, or why not do a chapter in first person? See where it goes. As I always say to people, your rough draft, no one's going to see it but you, right? So you're not wasting anything. You're getting to know your character. That might be something that helps you define that voice just a little bit more.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what are the things you have to really think about when you're trying to decide which way to go? I think one of them would be, when you think about the story itself, are there things that you need the reader to know that the character won't know, right? And if that's the case, then you kind of almost need to do third person.
Yeah, and you need to avoid that, kind of cliche of I looked in the mirror and saw my blonde hair and blue eyes. You need to sneak in things that tell us what the character looks like. And I suffer from that. Believe me, in my head, I know what he or she looks like, but if you're in first person, you can't conceit the, I put, like, you see it sometimes, it's very obvious. It's not lazy writing per se, but I think there are more creative ways around getting to know a character, even though we're reading his or her thoughts. That there are ways to kind of adapt and not go to those cliches, because yes, we all look at ourselves in the mirror, but we never think to ourselves, wow, my glasses are really shiny today, or whatever it happens to be.
Especially male authors writing about female characters, because it automatically is when they're looking at themselves in the mirror, they always think about the size of their breasts, which for some reason is like this thing that I don't know. I've never been a woman, but I don't think women think about that when they look in the mirror as much as some male authors think they do.
Yes.
Well, listen, I look in the mirror and I'm like, there's a lot of gray going on. I think that very often. So I don't know.
Yeah, but there I think in first person, even in third person, but however you do those descriptions, you'll find a way, and there are different ways to do it, and there are better ways to do it than, recognizing your cup size or whatever it happens to be in the mirror.
Yeah, for sure. So, but then in third person, like, obviously it's easy. You make those descriptions or whatever, but you have the downside is that, or maybe it's an upside, I guess. It depends on what you're writing, but not knowing the motivations of somebody is often, it can be, I guess it can be hard, or it can be easy, right? Or it can be a positive or a negative. In romance, a lot of times, you have somebody's, especially with the one chapter him, one chapter her, right? So you'll have those misunderstandings in the sense, like, when it's her perspective, he'll do something and she'll be like, oh, what a jerk, whatever. And then it switches to his, and he's like, in his head, you understand why he did it. It makes more sense, and you sympathize with them, and then you realize, oh, she's wrong. She doesn't get it. Oh, she doesn't understand what's happening here. And it's all that, right? With third person, though, it's like you just see it all, but you don't know any of their motivations at all.
Yeah, and I think there's the trying to avoid exposition kind of like, we need some exposition, of course, and no matter with your first or third, you kind of have to decide, I guess, for yourself. But no matter what author you are, I find myself, and this is for me personally, this is right for me, it might not be right for everyone, is that I'm writing character-driven stories. I'm not writing the great American novel. I'm writing contemporary fiction. This feels right for the genre. This feels right for me. I'm not going to try and push myself into a place like, oh, I have to write third person and that's the way it has to be. No, I feel so comfortable, and I write my first drafts quicker, and I do things quicker in first person. So I guess for anybody who might be struggling or starting out or whatever it is, to like, don't be so hard on yourself. And pick within the genre, because again, if you want to sell books, which is something we all want to do, you can't go too far off genre. But again, it's, to me, we're all readers at all times. So why did that work for someone? How did they make it work? If it was first person versus third person, did you even notice? Sometimes authors, hopefully myself one day or now, they can be so seamless that you're not even really going, oh, or in the case of third person, it's often like, I got to turn the page because we left these characters over here. Now we got to go find them over here. And I really want to know what they're doing. And in first person, the struggle is, on that individual level to say, okay, maybe we left the chapter where something major happened to this character, obviously to them, or they acted or they did something. So what is defining your story? Is it going to be character motivated, which is what I'm very comfortable with? Or is your story a little more, we're taking that kind of macro step versus the micro step? Really only you can answer that. But I always, in every book I pick up, no matter what genre, no matter what I'm reading, it's, why am I turning the page? How are they telling this story in a way that I want to keep reading?
Yeah, it's true. Sometimes I don't even realize if it's first or third, and I have to concentrate and think to myself, is this first or third person, that I'm reading? But it's funny what you said about the exposition, because that just makes me think about, there's some certain types of books where the exposition is almost, it happens so often, it's almost a cliche. And I think Roland probably knows this best, because like his favorite sort of James Bond kind of books, like at the end it's always the villain giving the big monologue about why he did everything. And
well, you also have the briefing scene with M, where it's like James Bond comes in and M says, let me encapsulate the plot in 5 minutes.
That's right. But my favorite is always at the end when he straps them down and he's got to make the whole explanation about everything and why he did it and how he's going to kill him. And and it's almost a cliche where I see it in movies and read it in other books where something happens and the villain's like, I'm not going to give you a big monologue about why I'm doing this, I'm just going to kill you, or whatever. Like, they know that that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, no, it's there are so many good examples and so many different examples, and especially, I'm going to have trouble remembering, but it's a Colleen Hoover book. It's Verity. I can't remember if it's in first or third, but what happens if your protagonist is an unreliable narrator, right? If we're having a narration from somebody who is in first person, but we actually can't trust them. And when do we, the audience, decide that? When do we make the choice that, oh, I'm in this person's head and I'm seeing what they're doing, but in reality, I don't know if I should trust them. So I think that's a book that I read quite recently where I think it is, I'm 90% sure, people can call me out, but it's first person. And as you read through and you keep reading, you're like, wait a minute. And again, just to say that just because you're in first person doesn't mean you can't, involve a second voice. And in this case, it comes, and I'm not giving anything away, but it comes in the form of a manuscript that the character is reading, or a diary that the character has come across. So, don't think like, oh, well, first person, it's the only thing, I can only do it this way. No. There are so many ways, I think, that are creative to get around that, to introduce voices, or to mix things up, or to make your, again, why do we trust, why are we in this person's head, and why are we trusting them immediately? We want to, as the reader, always do that. But maybe, depending on your writing or genre, like, is that what we should be doing? Should we be trusting this person? Great authors to me can always go, oh, wait, I got to chapter 3 and now I'm starting to feel differently about this protagonist.
Isn't it amazing?
It's always fascinating. Yeah, it is.
I'm just thinking that that's where writing when it's really good, when you're reading a book that like sucks you in, and then you have these different layers. It's the sign of like a writer who's like taken it to the next level. It's exciting when you get those little dopamine bursts every time you finish a chapter, because you find new information or new questions get raised, and then like you're fully immersed in the book. There's nothing better than that.
I agree. And I think certain books I've not gone back and read, but I think a second read would be necessary to go back and see everything that I missed, everything that was dropped in. Really good books will do that if you kind of go back and look and say, oh, look how clever this author was. Look at what they, chose to include that paid off here, paid off there. And again, no matter the first or the third, first, again, to me, it goes back to just being like that personal story, the personal kind of part of it. But then, the layers, as you said, that is it someone we trust? Is it someone, did you set out to have a protagonist that, we want to believe in, that's telling a story that's, we're here for? It really is genre specific, but I'm, like I said, I write happy YA novels. So mine, you should always trust my protagonist, I promise.
It must be tough though to write first person with an unreliable narrator, because I mean, you're in their head. So are they lying to themselves, or I guess you don't have to say every thought that they're having, right? So it could be, that he's just not thinking about what he's doing and why, but it would be tricky. And I think that is really pretty cool.
Yeah, maybe as as a writing exercise. I'm constantly editing or writing, but if you, again, were kind of warming up or getting around or wanted to challenge yourself, do 1,000 words or 1,500 words and just say, here's somebody we're not supposed to trust, and put yourself out there to say, I'm going to write it first or third or whatever, but probably first. It sounds like a incredible writing challenge to go, okay, I usually write this, but this time I'm going to write that, and see where it leads you.
Now, have you seen a lot of examples of people that use first and third in the same book?
Ooh, good question. I'd have to really think back, because I read almost, nothing's coming to mind. Do you have any examples?
I've read a couple. I've actually read one science fiction book that was like that, and I hated it. I have to admit, it was written in the first person perspective from a character for about 75%. And then that character died, and the rest of it was third person from another character's perspective. And it was a pity, because I loved the book up until that point. And then, so I think you've got to, it doesn't really make sense. I know Lee Child, we've mentioned before, pops back and forth. I think there's one where some of it's in first person and then they have third person. But it's weird. It doesn't feel right, because it's like, oh, what? Suddenly I'm like sucked out and have this hovering viewpoint, whereas I've been in Reacher's head before then. It's like, it's jarring.
Yeah, I think that the only way to possibly do it is, that would be non-jarring to me, is if we were reading like a newspaper, clipping or something like that, where we were taking out, and then like the start of the chapter might be something like that. And then we're going first and third, and I was trying to think, have I ever read second? But it's so rarely used. Wasn't there an adaptation of Wicked, I want to say like 15 years ago, and I think it was the only second person book I've ever read in my entire life. I know we have to Google it real quick, but it's, I know this conversation is first and third, but maybe there's somebody out there who's going to break ground on second person.
Because that would be basically like you're reading a book that says you got up, you went to the kitchen,
Mhm.
you brushed your teeth and stuff. And that's weird.
Well, I feel like I did read some second person perspective. When I was a kid, maybe. Is it?
Apparently, there are a bunch of them. I just Googled it. There are 8 great novels written in the second person.
There we go.
Have you heard of any of them?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of any of them or heard of any of these authors. But apparently, they're great.
Was it Choose Your Own Adventure books? Were they written in second perspective?
Yes,
like you walk down the So that's what I'm thinking of that I read as a kid. Like you walk down the stairs. So do you go left or do you go right?
But that makes sense.
Yeah, right.
I guess in the context,
so it can
it's
be
all
done.
about the context.
Yeah,
it can be done, but
is.
It's fairly limited. Yeah, that's why I think most people go first and third. And then there's also sort of levels of I guess it's more of third, maybe it's first as well, where you have the different depths that you can drill down or go up, I guess. The omnipresent, and there's like I forget all the names of them. I remember reading something once that was sort of explaining these different levels, like where you see everything and everything in their heads, and then there's levels where you only see what they see, versus so when you're doing sort of third, do you think about those levels and figure out where you want to be, or is that just you always just do it one way?
I think it would be, to me, genre specific. So I'm trying to think. Most of my current third is adult contemporary, which is not published yet. And those were decisions of genre. So if I'm writing, let's say, thriller adjacent, those are, if you're an audience, you have a really specific expectation as you go in. Now, if I'm Lee Child and I've written Reacher, people know me and I can write any way I want, or I'm James Patterson, I can write any way I want. Courtney Brandt, pen name, and Benjamin, I don't really have that choice. So to me, again, commercially speaking, that I'm going to be reading in the genre, seeing what is working, seeing what people would expect, so that if somebody downloads my book, that they're not turned off, that this is, I expected a book like this, and this is what I got. It's not that I'm putting myself in a corner or I'm restricting myself creatively. It's just, this is the genre I've chosen to write in. And to be, I think, successful, you can play with that, you can do different things. But for me, I would say, okay, if the comps in the market for my book would be X, Y, and Z, okay, then it should follow X, Y, and Z, so that if I recommend my book to someone to say, if you liked these books or these authors, then you would probably like my book. And I think that, the noble practice of writing and being an author is super important, but the importance of selling books is equally important, so that, we want people to read our books. We want to tell stories that resonate with people. We can only do that maybe in certain genres when we adhere to the genre. So whether it's third person and I do everything, or it's third person and I follow, some of the really traditionally successful books, that's my choice to make. But I do think that to appeal to the widest audience, if I'm doing contemporary thriller or thriller adjacent, that's what people are going to expect. And I should give that to them. I can do it in my own way, but I do need to kind of, say, okay, well, this is what's worked and it's worked for a reason. How do I do my own story in that way?
And then when we look at first person, you had mentioned this earlier, maybe we should talk a little bit about it in case people aren't totally aware. So the past versus present, right? And this is something I know I always had problems with. I would just, pick one and then sort of switch around while I was writing. And I'm sure that was a problem for my editor. But yeah, like maybe let's go through what the difference is on those and why you'd want to use one over the other.
So it's interesting because I had written mostly first person, like past, and then suddenly I get this protagonist, Julia, and she's got to tell it now. And there was just something about that character specifically. Everything she did was so specifically present. And I think I even, like you, I tried to do the past and I ended up this like, messed up draft in the middle. And I'm working on the sequel now, like literally now, and it's done and I'm editing. And I have maintained the present. For other authors, like, don't do it to yourself to go back and forth because it will mess with you. Try and work on one and one only. But I guess in my case, again, being character driven, that Julia's story had to be now, and I can't explain it, then the other 2 or 3, their stories just weren't, it wasn't in that character's voice to write it. It was okay to be kind of the past. And hopefully that makes sense to some people. But in my mind, I was like, oh, she has to have this like currently happening to her because that's the character she is.
But in terms of some examples of like what it means to writing in the past or the present.
So it's your verbs, right? Like it's the verbs that are, instead of, they're, I guess, more active. And I'm sure some proofreader / grammar person out there is like, that is the worst example ever. It's how we think of things. I'm currently, this is, like we're talking, we haven't talked, right? So it's almost, I think, I'm trying to think of a good example. I feel like Hunger Games is present. So if you were looking for a good example, that would be an excellent example.
I've read a lot of contemporary romance that is present. It's like he sits down opposite me and then he unravels his chewing gum and pops it in his mouth and makes a pop.
Yes. To me, there's something just really engaging, but it doesn't always happen. In the many books I've written, in this case, it's only one specific protagonist that is present. But yeah, it's to me about the action. And yeah, that's a really bad explanation, but I'm sure there are resources you guys can provide.
And it is one of those, I personally, like, I have to really get into a book to enjoy it in the present. But you're right, it depends on the characters. And I've read a bunch of them, but I remember I used to edit other people's books and it threw me when it was in the present tense. And then when I would try and do my own writing, I'd find myself writing in the present tense and I'd be like, it's one of the reasons I kind of got out of it. But when it's done well, it works, depending on the character, I guess.
Yeah, it's a total mindset though. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the difference of saying, like I walked to the store yesterday versus like I walked to the store. I walked to the store versus I walk to the store, or I am walking to the store. It's the difference is it happened to me yesterday versus it's happening right now.
Happening to me now, yeah. So said versus says, or asked versus asks. So if Julia asks or my friend asks, that's happening to her right now versus asked, which again, there are pros and cons to both. But as Roland pointed out, if you are in one frame of mind, which I am currently living first person present, it would be very difficult for me to switch over to another project and not really put that in. Like you have to give space to that because it will affect your other writing, I promise.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that was the thing I had the most problems with, is just keeping to one. I just wouldn't even think about it. This different sentence to sentence would probably be different, right? And I'd try to catch them in edit, and then I'm sure my editor had to catch the rest of them. But yeah, it can be confusing for sure. I mean, and you do have to mix it sometimes, right? So even if you're in present, you're talking, everything's happening, but then you say, oh, I just spoke to Bob and he asked me, then you got to switch to past anyway.
In the dialogue. And it even bleeds over. I do food writing as well. And when I set out to write reviews now, I do it in present, and then I'm like, wait. This happened in the past. I could do this in past. And then, as you said, like I've got verbs all over the place. And when I go back through, I'm like, okay, now I know I need to look out for it. But I think for those who are kind of starting out the journey of perhaps first person present, like it's going to take a little time to get used to. But again, what are you comfortable with? What is your character telling you? What is the story telling you? Just keep going back to that because it's there. I think the answers are always there if your story is developed or the idea is developed.
Right.
Absolutely. It's yeah, and it's so interesting. Again, I mentioned like how books, you were talking about the book where you had an unreliable narrator, and that's like taking writing to the next level. I think also when it comes to thinking about how to tell your story through the point of views, that's again, it's like it's a thing most people don't appreciate about how difficult and how exciting writing is. The fact that you've got all of these different ways to tell all of these different stories. It's like you're almost a cinematographer in your head. You're not only writing the story, but you're also making a movie of it.
Well,
And
it can be a completely different story, right? When you're into, I remember when I was reading a lot of science fiction, one of my favorite authors was Orson Scott Card. And, he wrote Ender's Game, which was one of his biggest ones. And, there was a number of books. And then at one point, he basically rewrote the books, but from one of the other characters' perspectives. And it's like, it was like almost like a different book. It's the same actions were happening, but now you're inside the head of another character, seeing it through their eyes and why they made those decisions. It's almost like getting a cheat to be able to write your book in both, because you couldn't decide which would be better, right? It's like, I'll write it in third, but then later I'll write it again in first and sell it twice.
Why not? No, it's so funny because I feel that in approaching this conversation, it was all my decisions have been very unintentional. There was only one point when I first started the book that's first person present, I did start it in first person past. And then I was like, why isn't this working? I know something's kind of wrong here. So I think it's okay to admit, I made a mistake, and actually maybe first person present is insane, and why would anyone do it? Or, if I'm, what works for me, and why is this working? I always try and ask those questions. I've been a member of a book club for many years, and none of the other people in the book club are authors. And I always like to ask these questions, from just like, I'm not going to get word nerd on them, but I am going to say, why did this work? And that's it. Like, why did this work? That's a very easy question to answer. Why do we like this character? Why did it? No one's ever bringing up tenses, of course, or first person or third person, but I'll ask it. I'll sneak my questions in. What did we have this month? We had a very unreliable narrator this month. Pretty good, actually. And I'm trying to think of the author, but it was first person, and it had to be first person. There's no other way this book would be so raw. And I applaud that author for making it just so real and really an unlikable protagonist. But you kept reading because it was kind of a train wreck, and you have to see how it turns out.
Yeah, it's such a key. It can be such a key decision to make when you're writing a book on which way to go. It's probably true that most books could be written as first or third, but there's probably one that is notably better for the book. And so, the trick of for the author would be figuring out which way that will be before they start writing, and hopefully, before they get long into the process and realize that was not the right choice, and have to start all over again.
Yeah. And we've seen, we've seen people take even classics, that are written very third person, from 100 years ago. And then they just go, you know what? I know there's like a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sort of like out story. And you can take some of these classic characters and go into first person. And I think that's another fascinating thing, that there's all these literary characters from just, decades and centuries ago, and people keep finding new stories with them. Is it Madeline Miller who did Circe and Achilles? Like, who knew that these characters had stories, and they're very personal stories. So it's there are just so many ways to unpack even characters we know already could be done in first person that maybe haven't been done yet.
And like Sherlock Holmes just came out of copyright. That's it. So now you can write all the first person Sherlock Holmes books you want.
Or it'll be Sherlock Holmes and zombies.
Yeah,
there's
that's
that.
the big thing.
I think
gotta add zombies to all the old books.
Yeah, I think Gatsby's now in the public domain. I think Winnie the Pooh is now in the public domain. So people can go crazy.
They just made a horror movie about Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, maybe that's why.
Maybe don't do that. But if you like, but yes,
just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very good advice for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Sadly, we are approaching the top of the hour, I was going to say.
Yeah, and well, one last thing is just if for somebody who's sort of new to writing, what do you think is do you think that there is a an easier way to go if you can't decide, if you think both would be equally good, or you're not even sure really? What's easier in your opinion to write, first or third?
It depends on the genre. I think you should write to genre. I think you should look and see what's been successful, and I think you should do that. So if you're really new, and you want to approach a genre and you want to eventually sell that book, in my mind, you won't waste as much time if you stick to what is there. So in young adult, I have the freedom to always write first person because it's very successful. In romance, you can write first person. But if you are going to write more thriller, maybe even just contemporary fiction, really get into who's selling and why. And if they're writing third person, you should probably choose to write third person, because if you're going to an agent one day or you want to go out, you just need to go, okay, well, yes, The Martian is first person. That was done in a very unique way. But, there are plenty of examples. Just go to your bookstore, go on Amazon, you'll see, go to your genre, and then just start reading the blurbs. Are we writing in first person? Is it in third person? To me, that's your homework. If you are starting out, just look in your genre, look at your comps, and start there.
That's excellent advice. Well, thank you so much, Courtney. This has been a fascinating discussion. It's one of my things I get so passionate about. It's really about the craft of writing, and it's the juicy stuff we enjoy. So where can people find your books and read you firsthand?
Yes, on Amazon. It's going to be a busy year. So if you follow me on Amazon, that's probably the best. But I've got, as I would say from Dubai, inshallah, I've got 3 books this year. I had a busy year of editing last year. So we've got sequels, I've got original. It will be a busy year. Just follow me on Amazon.
That is wonderful. Well, we will make sure to pop a link down below so people can do exactly that. And thank you so much for joining us, Craig. Do you have any final thoughts?
No.
But thanks for joining us, though, and especially for making time from Dubai. I know the time difference and everything is difficult. So, but this was a great discussion. I think it's really helpful to people to really sort of hear the reasonings why you do one or the other. The genres that it works best for, etc. So, I really appreciate you giving us your thoughts on that.
My absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to hearing from it. And of course, if anyone has any questions, I'm not the ultimate expert, but I always love hearing from people and talking about writing. So feel free to reach out.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. And hopefully everyone listening to this or watching it on YouTube enjoyed everything Courtney had to say. If you did, make sure to leave a comment down below. Let us know. And if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. Thank you so much for supporting us. Bye-bye.